Okay, let's dive right into this, because tarot in the 21st century presents us with a truly fascinating paradox. On one hand, you open up TikTok or Instagram, and it is this pervasive, incredibly popular aesthetic, a trendy tool for creative self-discovery. But on the other hand, it still carries this lingering, almost stubborn reputation of the obscure, the irrational, and, the carnival fortune teller. But to really grasp what's going on here, we have to look way past the colorful imagery. Today, in this explainer, we're going to treat tarot as what it actually is. It's a highly complex semiotic system. It's literally an intersection of historical parlor games, deep psychological models, and modern counseling practices. We've got quite a bit of ground to cover today, so here's our roadmap. We'll kick things off with myths and history, break down the anatomy of the deck, weigh psychology versus skepticism, look at the actual practice of reading, and finally anchor the whole thing in the real world with risks and German law. So, Section 1, Myths and Historical Facts. Now, what's really interesting about this first part is that we need to immediately debunk one of the most pervasive myths in popular culture, which is the idea that tarot originated in ancient Egypt. You'll hear these elaborate stories linking the cards to the Egyptian god Thoth or the Lost Library of Alexandria, but a critical historical analysis, it completely refutes this. There's just no truth to it. The true evolution is actually a story of cultural appropriation, and tarot's real roots are entirely secular. They began in 15th century northern Italy as trick-taking parlor games. Basically, nobles just added a fifth suit of trump cards, known as triumphi, to standard playing cards. The imagery reflected Renaissance society, not some secret mystical teachings. The occult shift didn't even happen until 1781 in France, when Antoine Court de Gebelin published Mon Primitif. He literally invented the Egyptian origin myth out of thin air during a period of intense Egyptomania. This all culminated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn standardized the modern decks. You get the famous 1909 Rider-Waite-Smith deck, which was a total game changer, because Pamela Coleman Smith illustrated scenic images for every single card, making it instantly accessible. And later you have the 1944 Thoth Tarot by Aleister Crowley, taking a much more abstract, philosophically dense approach. Moving on to Section 2, Anatomy of the Deck. Knowing that the history is this wild blend of a card game and later philosophy, let's look at the actual structure of this 78-card deck. Because it's not just a random assortment of pictures, it operates as a tightly closed philosophical system. The deck splits into two distinct chunks. First, you have the 22 Major Arcana cards. These represent grand, overarching karmic lessons. This sequence is often referred to as the Fool's Journey. It's a narrative tracing a protagonist from pure, naive potential all the way to total integration, which is represented by the World card. But then, making up the vast majority of the deck, you have the 56 Minor Arcana cards. And these represent our fleeting, everyday phenomenological experiences. And this brilliantly illustrates how those 56 everyday Minor Arcana cards function. They're divided into 4 suits that map directly onto the classical elements. So wands align with fire, representing ambition and action. Cups align with water, covering emotion and intuition. Swords connect to air, dealing with intellect, which, let's be honest, often involves conflict or pain. And pentacles represent earth, our material reality, our finances, physical health. Within each of these suits, the numerology tells a mini story, from the ace acting as a pure seed of potential, all the way up to the 10 representing completion or transition. And right above the numbers sit the court cards, pages, knights, queens, and kings. These represent specific personality aspects or maturity levels within that particular element. Which brings us right into Section 3, Psychology, Esoterics, and Skepticism. The million-dollar question here is, how exactly do randomly shuffled pieces of printed cardstock make accurate statements about a person's incredibly complex life? Well, here is where 3 entirely different worldviews collide. First, let's look at the esoteric and spiritual perspective. Practitioners often rely on Carl Jung's concept of synchronicity. This is the idea that 2 events can occur simultaneously and share profound meaning without actually having a physical cause and effect relationship. So imagine you're struggling with a relationship. You shuffle and you draw the Lover's card. There's no physical cause making that specific card appear on top, but there is a meaningful coincidence. Now, some modern spiritual theories even attempt to borrow concepts from quantum mechanics to explain this, though it is super important to note that these are highly controversial and generally viewed by the scientific community as pseudoscientific adaptations. But we can also look at this without any supernatural elements at all. From the psychological perspective, the cards function exactly like a Rorschach inkblot test. They contain rich, archetypal imagery from our collective unconscious, basically providing a projection screen. You aren't predicting the future, you're pulling your own hidden thoughts to the surface. It's a process vital for what psychologists call shadow work, integrating the parts of ourselves we tend to suppress. Conversely, cognitive science and the skeptical perspective explain tarot's accuracy through the Barnum or Forer effect. That's our tendency to believe vague, generalized statements are highly personal to us. Skeptics also point to cold reading, where a reader uses sharp observation and a rapid shotgunning of guesses to see what sticks, combined with the client's own confirmation bias. Remembering only the hits and conveniently forgetting all the misses.
Regardless of which of those perspectives you align with, there is a very specific methodology to how these readings are actually executed in the real world. Let's look at the concrete steps in Section 4, the practice of reading cards.
A session doesn't just start with throwing some cards on a table. It begins with grounding. A reader needs a clear mental state, often visualizing roots going into the earth or using sensory techniques like physically washing their hands to clear emotional static. Then comes the shuffling, whether that's an overhand shuffle, riffling, or washing the cards around on the table. The client focuses on their intention until a completely intuitive stop is found. The real heavy lifting, however, happens in step 4, synthesis. A skilled reader isn't just reciting a textbook memory, nor are they just randomly guessing. They are synthesizing the structural book knowledge, the skeleton of the card's traditional meaning, with rapid, unconscious pattern recognition, which we often just call intuition.
So, the crucial point is that a card's meaning is entirely dictated by its context within a layout, which is known as a spread. The 3-card spread is incredibly versatile for linear analysis. Notice how pulling a heavy card like the Ten of Swords means something entirely different if it lands in the past position versus the future position. It's like a formula that can be adapted to analyze a timeline, troubleshoot a specific obstacle, or weigh option A against option B.
Now, for deeper complexities, practitioners use spreads like the famous Celtic cross, which was popularized by A.E. Waite. This one utilizes 10 distinct positions, really digging into conscious goals versus subconscious roots, or self-perception versus environmental influences. And the true skill here isn't just looking at the likely outcome card in a vacuum. It's like a giant puzzle. The skill is finding the psychological correlations across the entire spread, noticing, for instance, how a person's subconscious roots might be in direct conflict with their stated hopes or fears.
So, we know the history, we know the mechanics, and the psychology. Let's pivot to Section 5, utility, risks, and the law. What are the practical utilities of doing this? What are the serious dangers? And how is this practice regulated by strict legal frameworks, particularly in places like Germany?
On the positive side, tarot actually offers highly pragmatic modern utilities. It acts as a phenomenal tool for emotional intelligence through externalization. Basically, taking a diffused, confusing anxiety out of your head and putting it onto a visible card on the table where it can actually be analyzed. Creative writers use these archetypes heavily for character plotting and breaking through writer's block. But most importantly, ethical tarot reading is designed to restore personal agency. It doesn't tell a fatalistic, unavoidable destiny. It shows you changeable tendencies. It essentially says, hey, here is the current trajectory. And if you don't like it, here is exactly where you have the power to change your behavior. However, we have to talk about the psychological risks because they are severe. Uncritical use can lead to tarot addiction, resulting in a state of learned helplessness, where an individual feels they literally cannot make even trivial everyday decisions without consulting the deck first. Furthermore, drawing traditionally scary cards like the Tower or Death can trigger the nocebo effect in vulnerable individuals. This happens when the mere belief in a negative prophecy subconsciously alters a person's behavior so much that they turn it into a self-fulfilling reality. Let's move to the legal side and see how this builds, because these psychological risks are so very real that the law has actually had to step in. According to the German Federal Court of Justice, or BGH, fortune-telling is rather bluntly classified as an objectively impossible service under Section 275 of the German Civil Code. Neutrally speaking, from a purely legal standpoint, it is physically impossible to guarantee a successful look into the future.
But the German legal landscape is actually wonderfully nuanced here. Even though the service is technically impossible to guarantee, practitioners can still legally claim their honorarium or fee. The catch is, the client has to be fully aware that they are paying for a spiritual or entertainment service and not a scientific fact. However, a hard line is drawn at exploitation.
If a reader leverages a client's vulnerability, their grief, or their lack of judgment, for example, scamming them by claiming they need to pay exorbitant fees to remove some fake curse, the contract becomes entirely void due to immorality, or as it's known in German law, Sittenbruchkrieg. In these cases, clients have a strict legal pathway to demand refunds, protecting them from extreme financial exploitation.
Ultimately, when we zoom out and look at the actual history, the psychological projection, and the legal guardrails, tarot emerges not as some infallible oracle, but as a surprisingly powerful sparring partner for introspection. The cards, they just provide the framework. The real insights come from within. Which leaves us with this final thought for you to chew on. If this entire deck is ultimately just a mirror reflecting the depths of our own subconscious, is the true magic hidden in the printed cards, or is it entirely in our own minds?